Happy motherfucking New Year, everyone. And what best way to bring in 2019 than with a lot of triple-titted demon creatures known as Slaaneshi demonettes. And with that, the lore of Slaanesh. And this is going to be a pretty interesting one we're going to talk about here today. This is a chaos magic that has been arguably the most competitive of the demon magics, especially in 8th edition. The 8th edition lore of Slaanesh is extremely geared toward tweaking your nipples, slowing people down, and doing a shit ton of damage. In previous editions, in 7th edition, there's a lot of the same spells, actually, almost word for word, exactly the same spells. But in 6th edition, we see a lore of Slaanesh that is a lot more about board control and getting your opponent to do certain things that they wouldn't otherwise do. Like, you know, trying docking for the first time. But let's move on to the lore of Slaanesh itself and what the lore attributes for it are, the additional spells of it, and kind of talk a little bit at the end of this video about 6th edition and how that really kind of plays into things here. I think that the lore of Slaanesh is going to be a very big challenge for Creative Assembly because it doesn't do a lot of kind of one-to-one conversion type mechanics. A lot of it is based off of leadership roles that you do not make in Total War Warhammer. So if you're trying to bring Total War Warhammer 3 onto the table and you're trying to bring lore of Slaanesh in with it, there's going to have to be a lot of tweaking or borrowing from previous editions. So let's jump on in here. We'll start with the Born of Damnation, and this is the lore attribute for the lore of Slaanesh, and it's very similar to the lore of Nurgle in some way. How lore of the children of Nurgle kind of get they get to replenish some wounds, right? Well, with the lore of Slaanesh, with the Born of Damnation, anytime your spells from the lore of Slaanesh do damage, choose a unit of either demonettes or fiends of Slaanesh, which you're basically either your little like wolf, not wolf, but little like quadruped creature, demon, claw-titted, nipple-piercing things, and demonettes, which we just talked about earlier. That's basically your foot soldiers of Slaanesh. You choose one of those units, and that unit in of itself recovers wounds, but not in the same way that it does for Lore of Nurgle. It just gets an outright whole new model, so it's really cool. You resurrect what's died, whereas Nurgle just kind of replenishes the wounds that have been created. So the lore of Slaanesh is very competitive in that you can do a lot of damage to things because all the spells, for the most part, do damage. There's very few that don't do damage. There's like maybe one or two. Actually, I think there's only 2 spells that don't do damage. And if they do damage, and a lot of these do a lot of damage, then you get a new model that adds to the unit. So how this I think would be translated in Total War Warhammer is exactly what we see with stuff like Curse of Undeath or the Lord of Nehekara's lore attribute. Just outright resurrecting and healing things. Maybe even not even healing, only resurrecting based off of... It'd be cool if they could do this based off like some sort of like damage spectrum. Like, okay, let's just say Lash of Slaanesh. This is the first spell we're going to talk about. Let's say Lash of Slaanesh does 5,000 points of damage. And let's say a Demonette's individual unit model is, just for easy numbers, 1,000 health. So for 5,000 points of damage that comes out of the lore of Slaanesh, you get 5 unit models of Demonettes replenished either to the army, to one in specific. I'm not really sure how they would actually do it. I think it would be to the army as a whole, and they would kind of split the difference. Like, okay, we're going to add 5 unit models to, you know, 1 each. And of course, this would be a lot more per the damage appropriate, but I'm just trying to give you guys a perspective on how Born of Damnation could work in the game. I think just replenishing things is a little too old hat, right? We see that with too many things, but I think outright resurrecting them is true to the lore attribute itself and to the lore of Slaanesh. And it'd be a fun little addition to Total War Warhammer 3. So let's jump in then on Lash of Slaanesh, which we brought up here, which is our signature spell. A long, tongue-like whip of energy erupts from the caster's forehead and slashes into the ranks of his enemies. So this is a pretty easy one here. It's got a pretty modest range of around 2 feet, and it's a direct damage spell. And it draws a line, and anything in between the caster and the endpoint of that line, those 24 inches, takes damage. So how I would see this translated to Total War Warhammer is actually pretty easily. You know how we see abilities like Scorch or Tyrion's Sword, how it's got that very thin line of attack that does damage. I see that being the exact same thing here. It'd have a really cool animation, but I think it's just a really cool kind of customizable breath attack, quote unquote, that have a very, very small cone, very long and small cone, small as far as the angle of it and long as far as the actual direction of damage it can do. and does AP damage. That's going to be a lot of the repeating things that we're going to see at the Lore of Slaanesh. Does a lot of AP damage, and we've seen that almost with our with a lot with the Lore of Tzeentch and a lot with the Lore of Nurgle. So you can see that the demon lores do a lot of damage to armored units because that's like kind of like their biggest threat. All of the low armor chaff units of the armies of Warhammer didn't really stand much of a chance against demons because they all had ward saves. They did a considerable amount of damage. They had a high toughness, a lot of attacks or wounds, or even high initiative, so they attacked first. But armor was always supposed to be the kind of thing that the demons struggled with. Their demon ward save kind of helped them in that regard, but that's why all the Lores of Magic kind of aim at cracking open armor. That kind of, again, speaks to things a little bit truer here. And you'll see with Lore of Slaanesh how it plays directly into being the antithesis of elves as a whole. And ironically, you know, how Slaanesh in and of itself devours the souls of elves, and that plays very heavily into some of the additional effects of his ability. So we'll go into that in a little bit here in our next ability here. Acquiescence. With an almost lackadaisical gesture, the wizard engulfs his foe with a haze of broken dreams and unattainable desires. This is a pretty easy one here for the tabletop. It's a hex ability, and it inflicts 2 maladies, I guess you could say. So things now always strike last, regardless of their initiative, what weapons they're using, their abilities, everything like that. And then they have random movement. So these things obviously don't make a one-to-one translation, but always strike last. The way it works in tabletop is exactly what I just said. You know, you're going to attack behind everything. Elves all have always strike first. So that means that if they have great swords, which usually make you fight last, they were able to strike first. So I can't remember what the rule was if something inflicts you like this. I think if you have always strike first and you're given always strike last, it's like either order of operations, like, okay, which one affected you last, or you then, they wash each other out and you fight on initiative. I can't remember off the top of my head, and if you guys do in comments, please feel free to let me know and correct me. But we can't really see this translated into Total War, especially the random movement. You know, and this is you roll d6 and you roll a scatter die 2 and you roll that movement inches in that direction. We don't see that in Total War Warhammer. So what this could be simply is a reduction in attack speed, a reduction in charge bonus, and a reduction in movement speed. Really simple. Just a simple kind of reduction to all those abilities. No damage. Well, we'll save that for later, but no damage. Just an overall penalty to all these abilities. You could actually have random movement be some sort of rampage, but we'll talk about that mechanic, I think, later. That I think would make sense here. Some sort of like custom rampage for this lore. So we'll go on. And that I think actually it's a 3 or 4 spells from now. But our next one here is Pavane of Slaanesh. The caster whistles the tune of one of the darkling dances of Slaanesh, causing his foe to jerk spasmodically until bones snap. This one seems pretty simple, right? Direct damage spell, and they have to pass a leadership test in order to basically negate the spell. If they pass leadership test, then they don't suffer 3d6 wounds. So, suffer a wound with no armor saves. They have to roll 3d6. The way that leadership test worked in Warhammer Tabletop was you had a leadership value. For elves, it was typically 10. You'd roll 2 dice, and you had to roll your leadership or below. If you rolled 11, your unit was considered broken. So if you have a leadership of 10, which is great, it's some of the best leadership you can have in the game, rolling 2d6, you're almost always guaranteed to pass it. Now, if you roll 3d6, it makes it a lot harder. So 3d6, of course, it's going to add up. So if you get 3 4s, boom, there it is, 12. You're fled if you're an elf. So it made those passes, those rolls, a lot more difficult. And again, Pavane of Slaanesh, Acquiescence, both kind of target elves as far as making them or allowing Slaanesh to crack open elves. They're their kind of most hated enemy, and elves in return, Slaanesh being their most hated god. Now, I don't really know how they would do the leadership portion of this. Pavane of Slaanesh just could simply be a direct damage spell that is meant for single target or large target entities. And unfortunately, I think that's kind of very indicative of a lot of the stuff here that we're going to talk about. But that might be the kind of crux here, is this Lore of Slaanesh is not going to do a lot of wide-sweeping damage to the table, but it's really going to help you snipe out lords, do a crap ton of damage to low model count, large monstrous infantry, and monstrous cav, which we're going to see a lot of, hopefully, in Total War Warhammer 3. If Total War Warhammer 3 has ogres, that's a lot of large low count models. So that would be great for them. If we see Chaos Dwarfs, we're going to see a lot of their versions of demons. Well, no, they're just outright demons. In the, not Inkari, but the Kadai and other sorts of portions of the Chaos Dwarf army. Even if we had Kislev, and Kislev would have, like Bear Cav and Bear units in of themselves. So Profane Slaanesh does have a home in what it would be up against in Total War Warhammer 3. Now, Hysterical Frenzy is a pretty cool one here. The caster's victims are engulfed by a torrent of unreasoning emotion, causing them to claw at themselves with excruciating pain and blissful rapture. Now, this is our first ability here that actually does no damage as far as it being a direct damage spell. What it is, though, is that sorry, I corrected myself. Acquiescence didn't do damage. I'm so stupid sometimes. Hysterical Frenzy grants Frenzy to a unit, but at the same time, that unit also suffers damage. So you can cast this on a unit of Demonettes, give them Frenzy, have them really get up there up close and personal, because if they already have Frenzy, it increases the effectiveness of their Frenzy. So that's something I'd love to see is if something has Frenzy, either in the tabletop it doubles it, so I don't know if doubling it would be overpowered or not, but maybe even like a 1.5 increase on its current Frenzy stats would be pretty insane, pretty cool. But using this on, say, okay, let's go cast Frenzy on an enemy unit that is mulching through a chaff unit. Great, but it's going to do persistent damage to them at the same time. And it doesn't do a ton of damage. It's D6 Strength 3 hits, and Strength 3 is not very high at all. So I wouldn't see this as doing, a Phantasmagoria level AP high damage that just completely wrecks a unit. But I would see it as really being a great way to destroy Skirmisher Cav, or helping you really knock down and pinpoint any kind of rear or back charges from mid-tier Cav. When we look at, say, the Knights of the Realm, which are still heavy Cav, but they're not your shock troops of the Grail Knights or Grail Guardians. So Hysterical Frenzy, I think, is kind of used in those niche situations where you're trying to negate the overall effectiveness of an elite unit by granting it more killing power to kill something you own, which of course that sucks, but the damage that it will do over time, or even just to use it on a low strength unit, like goblins, to get a lot of damage into them so that you can rack up more of your Born of Damnation, that lore attribute we talked about, which is going to be replenishing your Demonette. So I could see this thing having a lot of plays in the kind of quote-unquote meta or placement of the lore of Slaanesh in the field. Now, Slicing Shards is a pretty cool one here. The wizard flicks his wrist and a cloud of razor-sharp darts burst from his hands, cleansing the minds, bodies, and souls of his foes. Now, this one's actually pretty cool. So it does D6 Strength 4 hits with armor piercing. Great, right? So we know this is going to be piercing some serious armor here. But what it does is the opponent has to pass a leadership test, or they suffer further D6 Strength 4 hits with armor piercing. They have to basically keep doing leadership tests until they pass. And every time they fail, they have to roll a D6, see how many Strength 4 hits that they take. Now, I don't know how to translate that into Total War Warhammer. You could do this simply as a wind attack and have it just do them down the line. You could have this doing some sort of constant damage that is just, okay, this is like a Phantasmagoria coupled with a leadership reduction. Pretty simple, kind of easy translation. But I think that they have to get a little special, and they have to get a little home-brewed with Total War Warhammer 3. With the Curse of the Vampire Coast, we got a whole bunch of new spells that are, they don't exist. Lore of Depths is brand new, and they did a lot of things that are a little bit different, but similar at the same time. I think Slicing Shards is going to be one of those Creative Assembly home-brewed spells that sticks true to the overall sentiment here, a damage over time ability, more or less, based off of a certain circumstance. And maybe that's it. Maybe the lower the unit's leadership is, or maybe the more leadership penalties that are incurred on it, the more damage Slicing Shards does. That could be a pretty cool one to kind of really help knock out a unit that is holding on by the skin of its teeth, like especially in those multiplayer matches when you're at the very end of it, or maybe in a campaign match when oh man, that captain is almost dead and my lord is just about to capitulate here. I'm going to use Slicing Shards and just completely destroy that guy so he can't win the day. So So maybe Slicing Shards is based off of that the disparity of your leadership in relation to it being at 100%. And again, maybe Slicing Shards doing more damage at a low leadership cost unit gives you more Demonettes and Fiends of Slaanesh to regenerate. Kind of things that I'm trying to all tie back to that lore attribute so we can see how that can be used in motion. Now, our second to last ability here is Phantasmagoria. With a complex sign, the wizard summons illusory creatures who flit and broil across the battlefield, their dark promises of fulfillment, seducing and bewildering the hapless foe. So this one is, again, based off of leadership. Until the start of the caster's next magic phase, the target unit must roll an additional d6 whenever it takes a leadership test. So that one's really cool, right? In tabletop terms. In Total War Warhammer terms, it's not that great. The way it works in tabletop is you roll that additional d6 and you just discard whatever one's the lowest one. So meaning you're having your two highest dice when you need to be as low as possible. So you can see how that has an issue. I can see Phantasmagoria as just simply a reduction in leadership, but I feel like it's just too... I mean, this is the second to last ability. It has a casting ability of a 10 up. So it needs quite the power pool to kind of pull off. So it feels cheap to make this a very high level leadership reduction. And that's just my personal opinion here. I don't really know a great way that they could make this translate into the game without just completely... Okay, well, it's not going to be a leadership thing. Let's look at the lore of this. Oh, complex sign, the wizard summons illusory creatures, flit and broil across the battlefield, their dark promises, fulfillment, seducing and bewildering the hapless foe. So maybe this has this, they go with the lore blurb, less of the actual rule itself, to create, again, a homebrewed spell that is true to the lore of Phantasmagoria. It'd be interesting if they could do this where you could summon up an ability like Phantasmagoria, and it would lock a unit effectively in combat. It would kind of like lock them down entirely as they kind of flit and broil across the battlefield. Their dark promises, fulfillment, seducing and bewildering the hapless foe. Like as they kind of try and like move these phantasms away from their eyes and kind of trying to make sense of the situation, trying to come out of the stupor that is created from Phantasmagoria. That's another translation of how they could do that, as almost like a rooting ability or Nets of Amontok. Could make some sense here, or maybe a rooting ability with a leadership reduction if you want to make it a little bit more robust. But let's jump into our last ability here, Cacophonic Choir. The wizard screams an ear-piercing chorus that tortures the souls and shatters the sanity of those who would stand in his path. And this one kind of borrows some mechanics of Acquiescence. So Acquiescence, we know from earlier in the video, it does always strike last and random movement. Well, this does those two things, but it does damage. The target unit takes 2d6 hits that wound on a 4-up, with no armor saves allowed. If at least one unsaved wound is caused, the target gains always strikes last and random movement. So maybe Cacophonic Choir is like this super ability that does Fate of Buna level damage, because no armor saves allowed is a crap ton of damage. And if you don't save it, then okay, always strike last and random movement for the tabletop. So maybe this is going to do damage that kind of stays on you like Fate of Buna, slows you down, reduces your charge bonus, and reduces your attack speed. You could also do this as a wind, or I'm sorry, not a wind, as a vortex. And it's just this screaming vortex of all sorts of different, a cacophony as it is, of different voices and all this singing aspects, just kind of wailing into the battlefield. At the same time, does a massive leadership hit. It incurs a massive reduction to your melee attack speed, but maybe does a ton of damage too, since it is a vortex spell. It is supposed to be ripping through the battlefield. So you can see here with the Lord of Slaanesh, it does need some tooling. It can't just kind of, oh yeah, we can just kind of copy this across and not be bothered with it. Now, the Lord of Slaanesh in what it's called the Lore of Pain and Pleasure in the 6th edition has a lot more stuff geared towards controlling. Like their top spell, Delicious Excruciation, is something that remains in play, and the unit is unbreakable for as long as the spell is in effect. So it replaces the instability rule of demons, because demons crumble off the board like vampire counts do, or Enrapturing Spasms, which force the the unit to move. So you can say, okay, that unit has got enrapturing spasms. They're going to move over here. The models in the unit cannot voluntarily move in the unit. Move in the movement phase and cannot shoot, attack, and the closer they are, they hit automatically in close combat. Oh, I'm sorry. This is not the one I'm thinking of. So enrapturing spasms basically lock something down. And that was something I kind of thought of for Phantasmagoria or Cacophonic Choir. But I think enrapturing spasms, if they brought that into the game, would be cool as almost this net of vomit type ability that just reduces their melee attack, or I'm sorry, their melee defense. And Delectable Torture here is another one, but basically is it causes any unengaged enemy character to turn on his army. So this is the one I wanted to kind of go into a little bit more. Is Delectable Torture is if it had a rampage mechanic that didn't apply to just your opponent, it applied to you as well. So you use Delectable Torture on either a high value target like a character or a high value target like a very strong unit, and that unit gets rampaged to whatever is around it, and it attacks whatever is around it until the effect wears off. So you're basically effectively doing damage to 2 units, and that damage, I guess you could link back then to Born of Damnation and get some additional resurrections onto your demonettes and demons or your fiends of Slaanesh. But Titillating Delusions is the one where the characters move a character for your opponent. So you can see that the 6th edition is more about control and less about damage. And they changed that. The Blissful Throws is the exact same thing as Lash of Slaanesh. That's the only outright damage ability that the 6th edition has. So I think that the Total War Warhammer 3 Lore of Slaanesh is going to have to borrow from 8th and from 6th edition to really be both competitive and competent, or else we're just going to get too much overlapping functionality that just doesn't make a huge translation to the grander game as a whole. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video here today. Have a happy new year. You know, this is the beginning of 2019. We got a whole new year of fun, exciting videos planned. I have a huge list I'm going to start cracking through. Some stuff on the horizon as I whip out this piece of paper. Let's see here. We've got, we're going to do a video on the 13th Grade Company. We've got more videos on the End Times. Next one up being Empire. Another Primarch video with Sanguinius. We're going to do stuff on the Phoenix Kings. Tons of other stuff coming up here for you guys. But hopefully you had a great and safe New Year's. Enjoy the rest of your week. We got plenty of stuff coming out here for you. But as always, guys, have a good one and take care.